Stroll number 321. Welcome, dear listener, to another slow descent into the peculiar corridors of the past. Tonight we turn the pages of a chapter often left unread, where laws were not just rules, but reflections of belief, fear, and imagination. Perhaps you're curled beneath warm covers, letting the day fade softly, or maybe you're watching the moon rise outside your window, seeking stillness in story. Wherever you are, thank you for joining me. And if you find comfort in quiet tales and thoughtful histories, consider subscribing. We have so much to explore together. The way medieval minds approached law was very different from how we understand justice today. While modern systems seek consistency, logic, and fairness, medieval societies relied on traditions, religious symbolism, and what can only be described as creative, even theatrical, interpretations of justice. Laws were not simply about maintaining order. They were mirrors held up to the collective psyche of an age obsessed with divine authority, moral purity, and social hierarchy. And sometimes those mirrors reflected things that seem absurd, even surreal to modern eyes. Let's begin with one of the most astonishing chapters in medieval legal history. The trials of animals, yes, actual animals, cows, pigs, even insects, were once brought before judges, assigned legal counsel, and held accountable for their actions. These weren't one-off curiosities, but recurring legal events that spanned centuries and stretched across many regions of Europe. In 1386, in a small town in France, a pig stood trial for the death of a child. The pig, found guilty, was executed in the town square, dressed in human clothes as though to emphasize its moral culpability. It sounds like folklore, but it's a documented legal proceeding, complete with witness testimony and official records. And it wasn't an isolated case. From France to Switzerland to Italy, animal trials were shockingly common. The reasoning? In the medieval worldview, everything in creation was part of a divine moral order. When that order was disrupted, even by a beast, justice had to be restored. A pig that killed a child had violated more than just safety. It had disturbed the cosmic balance, and balance demanded satisfaction. Bulls that gored farmers, dogs that attacked travelers, rats that overran granaries, any of these could find themselves named as defendants, and these cases weren't taken lightly. Legal documents from the time reveal detailed proceedings, including attorneys appointed to defend the accused animals. In one remarkable case from 1750, a donkey in France was put on trial for alleged bestiality alongside her human counterpart. Witnesses stepped forward, not to condemn her, but to vouch for her character. They testified that she was well behaved and had always been a gentle and moral animal. The court agreed. The donkey was acquitted, but her human companion, he was executed. Justice in this case was blind to species, but not to intent. This desire to assign moral agency extended even further. Inanimate objects were also brought to court. A sword that had been used in a murder might be tried, and if found guilty of being a cursed or evil instrument, it could be banished or destroyed. Bells that rang during storms and were believed to summon lightning were occasionally put on trial for causing fires or deaths. Trees that fell and killed passers-by could be condemned and cut down ceremoniously. It all sounds bizarre, because to us, it is, but to medieval Europeans, the world was woven together by threads of divine meaning. Everything had moral weight. Nothing was purely accidental. Which brings us to one of the strangest yet most widely practiced aspects of medieval law, trial by ordeal. These were rituals designed to let God determine guilt or innocence through physical tests. If you were accused of theft, sorcery, or murder, you might be required to walk 9 paces holding a red-hot piece of iron. Your hand would then be wrapped and left untouched for 3 days. If the wound healed cleanly, you were innocent. If it festered, guilty. Another form involved plunging your arm into boiling water to retrieve a stone from the bottom of a cauldron. Again, the healing process, not your word or any witness, was the final judge. And then there was the ordeal of cold water. Here the accused was tied up and thrown into a river. If they floated, they were guilty, because the water, pure and holy, had rejected them. If they sank, they were innocent. Unfortunately, innocence came at a price, drowning. There's a grim elegance to the logic. These ordeals weren't punishments in themselves, they were tests, and the outcome was left to divine will. Justice by way of miracle. It's easy to see the cruelty here, but for many in the Middle Ages, this was a comfort. Human beings could be wrong. God, they believed, could not. So if you passed the test, you were vindicated, not just by a court, but by heaven itself. One of the most dramatic expressions of this belief was trial by combat. When 2 parties had a dispute, especially over honor, land, or serious accusations like murder, they could settle it by fighting. Sometimes they fought themselves, other times they hired champions to fight for them. The result of the battle was seen as divine judgment. God would give victory to the righteous. Interestingly, women, elderly people, and even clergy could invoke trial by combat. While they rarely fought directly, they could name a champion, often a knight or trained fighter, to represent them in battle. And yes, women sometimes did fight. In Germany, there are records of judicial duels between men and women. To make the match fair, the man would stand in a hole up to his waist, armed with a club. The woman, free to move, fought with a stone in a cloth. The rules were precise, the symbolism unmistakable. Justice, in this context, wasn't about weighing facts. It was about dramatic displays of morality. It was about spectacle, about order, about fear, and perhaps about hope that the divine might intervene and tip the scales toward truth. These customs weren't reserved for distant villages or oddball cases. They were integral to how societies functioned. Law was theatre, ritual, and belief all bound together. To us, they seemed strange, but they made sense in a world where divine presence was assumed, where invisible forces governed everyday life, and where legal codes were not written for clarity, but for cosmic resonance. As we drift deeper into these ancient legal echoes, you might begin to see the strangeness of these laws lies not in their brutality, but in their beauty. They remind us that justice has always been a reflection of our values, our fears, and our longing to bring meaning to the chaos around us. So rest now. Let the flickering torchlight of the past warm your imagination. The next chapter awaits. No free to dodo. As we move further through this curious forest of medieval justice, the laws grow stranger still, not just in form but in intent. They weren't simply about preventing crime or punishing guilt. Often they were about defining order, placing people in their proper place in a world believed to be designed by God. In this world, your station mattered more than your actions. A noble and a peasant could commit the same offense, but receive wildly different punishments. A lord might pay a fine for a theft, while a laborer lost a hand. Justice was not blind. It saw your clothes, your lineage, your land. Sumptuary laws, for instance, told people what they could and could not wear, based not on taste or climate, but class. In England and France, laws forbade commoners from wearing certain colours, furs, or fabrics. Silk was reserved for nobility, sable fur for royalty. If a baker's wife dared to wear a velvet cap or a tunic with silver buttons, she could be fined, or worse, publicly shamed. These rules weren't about fashion, they were about reminding everyone of their place. Clothing was a visual code, a way to make hierarchy visible, and when that code was broken, it was seen not just as vanity, but as rebellion. In some towns, even shoes were regulated. Long pointed shoes called poulaines became fashionable in the 14th century, but only the upper classes were allowed to wear the truly extravagant ones, some so long they had to be tied to the knee to walk. If a commoner wore shoes too fine, they risked punishment. Style was status, and the law protected that status fiercely. But perhaps the most telling laws weren't the ones written about what people wore, but how they lived. In medieval Europe, behavior was often legislated down to the smallest detail, not only what one did, but when and how. Take curfews. Many towns instituted strict curfews not just for safety, but for moral order. Church bells would ring at sunset, signaling that fires must be extinguished, and all residents should return indoors. The belief was that nighttime invited sin, gambling, drinking, adultery, and worse. The curfew wasn't just about fire prevention, it was a spiritual boundary, a nightly cleansing of the streets. To be caught outdoors after curfew, without cause, could mean arrest, public whipping, or fines. Lanterns were required, and even then, you had to explain yourself, to guards, to neighbours, to God. Another law common in certain cities governed bread. Bread was the heart of the medieval diet, sustenance, currency, and symbol. Because of its importance, strict regulations existed around its weight, price, and ingredients. Bakers who cheated customers by selling loaves underweight or mixing in chalk or sawdust were dealt with harshly. One form of punishment? The pillory, where the baker would be locked in wooden stocks in the town square, sometimes with their bad loaves hung around their neck like a necklace of shame. In more theatrical towns, a baker might be paraded through the market on a donkey, backwards, holding their false bread aloft. The message was clear: feed your people fairly or be fed to their laughter. Food wasn't the only daily matter closely watched. Water usage, chimney smoke, noise after sundown, everything had its place, and laws crept into every corner. In some places, it was illegal to scold your neighbour too loudly. In others, a man could be fined for letting his pigs wander freely through the streets. And in at least one village record, a woman was sentenced to 2 days of penance for spreading rumours about a ghost in the well. Laws were not abstract in these communities. They were immediate, visible, and often deeply personal, and sometimes even your animals could get you into trouble. One law from 14th century Norwich stated that if a dog barked excessively during the night, the owner could be fined unless they proved the animal was alerting them to danger. Sleep, apparently, was sacred, and noise, even from a creature, was not taken lightly. Yet even within these rules, loopholes existed, especially for those with power. If a nobleman's hunting dogs trampled a peasant's field, there was often little recourse. If a merchant's son broke curfew while escorting a bishop's niece, the guards looked the other way. Justice tilted toward those with coin or title, but it wasn't always predictable, because just as medieval law could be rigid, it could also be whimsical, sometimes surprisingly progressive. In some parts of the Low Countries, laws were passed to protect battered spouses. long before such ideas gained traction elsewhere. In a few German towns, men who beat their wives could be stripped naked, tied to a cart and paraded through the streets, a wooden spoon in their mouth to symbolize disgrace. It was brutal, but it was a signal. Not all power went unchecked. Elsewhere, courts held mock trials for public catharsis. People would gather to judge the year at its end, blaming it for poor harvests, bad weather, illness. A scapegoat was chosen, dressed in rags, and symbolically punished or banished. It was part ritual, part satire, a legal exhale before the turning of the calendar. Law in the medieval mind was not just about rules, it was about stories. It was a performance of values, a daily declaration of who mattered, what was feared, and how the world should be. Some laws were never enforced, others were applied selectively, but all of them told a story, not only about justice, but about belief. They tell us what people thought was worth protecting, what they feared losing, and what they hoped to control in a world often governed by unpredictability. To modern ears, many of these laws sound irrational, but to those who lived beneath them, they offered structure, however flawed. They created rituals in a chaotic world, and they show us something essential, that the heart of every legal system is not just control, but meaning. Meaning drawn from faith, from fear, from tradition. As we drift into the next portion of our journey, keep that idea close. The laws may have been strange, but the people were not. They were trying to find their place in a vast, cold, confusing universe, just like we are. So rest now, let these old rules echo gently through your mind. They may be forgotten in books, but they remain, quietly, in the way we understand order, fairness, and the stories we tell ourselves about right and wrong. Sign of 3.203. As we continue wandering through the crooked alleys of medieval law, we begin to notice something. Beneath the strangeness, there's a pattern. These laws weren't always about logic. Often they were deeply emotional, ritualized responses to fear, to loss, to instability. They tried in their own flawed way to give people the feeling that someone or something was in charge. And one place this yearning showed up most vividly was in the church. Ecclesiastical law governed more than just priests and bishops. It seeped into everyday life, regulating marriage, morality, even meals. And while some church rules were grounded in scripture, others were startlingly elaborate or alarmingly invasive. Consider marriage. In many medieval towns, you didn't need a priest, a ceremony, or even witnesses to be considered married. If two people exchanged vows of intent, publicly or privately, they were, in the eyes of the church, bound, permanently. No takebacks. This led to legal chaos. One whispered promise in a field, one drunken exchange during a feast, could later be cited as a binding union. And if the couple split or tried to marry others, the old promise could be brought back in court. Imagine trying to argue that a midnight conversation you barely remember constitutes lifelong commitment, and you'll begin to understand how tangled medieval law could become. Adultery, too, was more than a private matter. It was a sin and a legal offense. Punishments varied: fines, penance, public confession. In extreme cases, physical punishment was enacted. A cheating wife might be paraded through the streets barefoot, her hair shaved, wearing a garment inside out. The shame was the sentence. Men faced penalties too, though often less theatrical. And this imbalance, this gendered tension, was written into many laws. A woman accused of sorcery, for instance, needed less evidence against her than a man charged with theft. Her reputation, her behavior, her neighbors' suspicions, they were often enough. Witchcraft laws were rooted in fear. Fear of women, of nature, of the unknown. While the infamous witch hunts came later, the groundwork was laid in these earlier centuries. Laws that quietly assumed guilt, especially for those on the margins. Midwives, herbalists, widows, those who lived alone or outside traditional structures, were especially vulnerable. A bitter neighbor, a failed harvest, a sick child, any of these could spark accusation. And yet, it wasn't only the women who were watched. Men too lived under scrutiny. Laws governed where they could drink, what weapons they could carry, how long they could stay at market. In some cities, unmarried men over a certain age were taxed for remaining bachelors, seen as shirkers of moral duty. Laws even tried to control laughter. In parts of Italy and France, public jesters were required to register their jokes. Satirical performances were monitored, and certain subjects, clergy, nobility, foreign powers, were off limits. To laugh at the wrong person, even in jest, could land a performer in jail or worse. But not all laws were about punishment. Some tried, awkwardly, clumsily, to protect. In Norway, for example, laws emerged to regulate the care of the poor during winter. Villagers were assigned households to feed and shelter the vulnerable for a set number of nights. After that, the responsibility passed to another family. This rotating system, though far from perfect, acknowledged a communal responsibility. The law turned charity into obligation. Elsewhere, legal codes outlined protections for orphans and travelers. Inns were required to offer shelter, even if only in stables. Ferrymen could be fined for refusing to carry passengers across rivers during dangerous seasons, especially if no alternatives existed. These rules weren't always enforced, but their presence on parchment showed that medieval societies, despite their harshness, did not lack compassion. They simply lacked consistency, and sometimes they lacked common sense. One law in a Flemish town required musicians to play their instruments at full volume when passing the mayor's house, to remind him of their presence. Failure to do so could result in a fine, or the confiscation of one's loot. Another ordinance in a German village stated that geese could not be walked through the market after sunset. The reason? Their honking disturbed the evening prayers, but even in these oddities you feel something endearing, an attempt to bring order, to define boundaries, to make a chaotic world a little more predictable. For medieval people lived close to chaos. War, plague, fire, famine, any day could change everything. So laws became anchors. They told people where to go, how to behave, how to survive. They told people that someone, somewhere, was keeping track. And while we might laugh at these rules now, it's worth remembering. We still do the same. We make signs, we pass codes, we set curfews, we wear uniforms, we file permits. Not always because it's necessary, but because it feels like control. And control, especially in uncertain times, can feel like safety. So as we continue forward, let's carry that understanding with us. The strange laws of the past weren't just about power. They were about people trying, desperately, to live with each other, to balance freedom and order, to keep peace without losing tradition, to face the unknown without falling apart. And yes, they sometimes got it wrong, but in those missteps, we find the most human truth of all, that justice is always evolving, that law is never finished, that every rule, every ritual, every strange little custom was part of a larger attempt to make meaning in the dark. And that's something we still do, even now. So close your eyes if you haven't already. Let these stories soften into dream. The world they came from is gone. But the questions they asked, what is fair? What is kind? What do we owe each other? Those still remain, and they are worth asking again. Law 73.2b. As we journey deeper into the tangled undergrowth of medieval law, we begin to notice something else. Beneath the lists of penalties and punishments, there's a rhythm, a structure that mirrors the human attempt to impose order where none naturally exists. The laws weren't just for criminals, they were for communities, for keeping the fragile web of life from unraveling in a world full of unknowns. This is clearest in the way laws tried to regulate time. Yes, time. Before clocks became common, time was fluid. It bent with the light, shifted with the seasons. So medieval towns used bells to mark the day, ringing out hours not by the minute hand, but by shared understanding. Sunrise, market opening, noon, evening mass, curfew. Missing these times wasn't just a mistake, it was illegal. In Paris, a shopkeeper who opened too early could be fined for disturbing the proper order. In parts of Italy, butchers could only work between certain hours, lest their trade offend religious practices or disrupt street cleanliness before morning prayer. And then there were laws around the Sabbath. On Sundays, markets closed, work paused, church bells tolled across rooftops and down valleys. But it wasn't only about devotion, it was about rhythm. The weekly halt helped unify time across class and region. You knew where you were in the world because everyone else stopped too. Of course, not everyone honoured this rhythm. So laws evolved. In England, a man could be punished for sharpening tools on a Sunday, even if it was for charity. In German towns, women were fined for spinning wool after Vespers. In Florence, a baker could lose his license if found selling bread during a holy procession. Some of these laws were enforced. Others were symbolic, meant to say, this is who we are, this is what matters. Because medieval law wasn't just about what you did. It was about when, and with what intent. Intent mattered, but proving it was another matter entirely. In the absence of forensic science, courts leaned heavily on oaths and character witnesses. You didn't just defend your actions, you defended your soul. To be believed, you needed someone to swear on your behalf, preferably someone well respected, a local elder, a priest, a merchant with clean books. These compurgators didn't offer evidence. They offered credibility. In a way, medieval trials were less about what happened and more about who was willing to vouch for you. This created its own legal economy. Influence mattered, relationships mattered. And while this led to favoritism and injustice, it also emphasized something central, the value of reputation. A good name was everything, and if you lost it, there were laws for that too. Defamation, spoken or written, could ruin lives. In small communities where everyone knew everyone, a single false accusation could destroy a person's standing, marriage prospects, or livelihood. So laws around slander and insult were unusually specific. In some towns, calling someone a thief without proof meant paying a public fine and delivering the apology in the market square under watchful eyes. In other regions, if you insulted someone's parentage, you owed them a certain number of loaves of bread, wine, or labor hours, depending on the severity of the slight. And if a noble was insulted, The punishment was not just social, but ceremonial. A man who mocked a baron might be forced to kneel before him with a rope around his neck, holding a candle, reciting words of humility as the town watched. Honor was visible, and it had to be restored in kind. But even these moments, strange, theatrical, sometimes cruel, carried a sense of balance. The law was often more about healing harm than extracting revenge. A wrong created an imbalance. The punishment aimed to restore symmetry, not always through suffering, but through symbolism. And nowhere was that more apparent than in the laws surrounding death. When someone died unexpectedly, the community responded not just with grief, but with legal ritual. If a body was found on the edge of town, bells rang. A hue and cry was raised, a coroner or his equivalent was called, and local villagers were summoned to form a jury of inquiry. These were not trained investigators. They were neighbors. They examined the body, inspected the scene, and listened to rumors. Then they issued a verdict. If the death was declared unnatural, the law demanded purification. The spot might be blessed, a candle lit, a stone cross raised to mark the place and warn others. And if the killer was unknown, the town itself could be fined by the crown, held responsible for failing to keep peace. This practice served a purpose. It motivated communities to police themselves, to maintain order, to remember the dead. Because forgetting the dead was also, in a way, illegal. Churchyards were sacred spaces. Graves were hallowed. Disturbing them, intentionally or not, was treated with utmost seriousness. Builders who unearthed bones while laying foundations had to halt work, notify the clergy, and pay for reinterment. Failure to do so risked not just legal penalty, but spiritual consequence. Cursed ground, restless souls, blighted buildings, law and superstition walked hand in hand, and this wasn't confined to churches or cemeteries. In one German town, it was forbidden to build over a crossroads where a known murder had occurred, lest the spirits disrupt the foundations. The law didn't call it haunting, but the intention was clear. Avoid the past or be troubled by it. Medieval law was, in many ways, a map of collective memory. It marked not just what was forbidden, but what was feared. Storms, fires, infertility, betrayal. So many laws addressed things that law could never truly control. But the effort mattered. The gesture mattered. To name something, to codify it, was to believe you could face it. And perhaps that's the most human part of all. We still do it. We still write rules for the things we fear. We build codes, structures, guidelines, not just for clarity, but for comfort. We say, here is what happens if the worst occurs. And in that saying, we feel a little safer. So as this chapter ends and the next begins, let your thoughts drift gently over these old and dusty laws, not as relics, but as reflections, not as absurdities, but as attempts to find meaning, to build peace, to keep the darkness at bay, even if only for a while. 10703.20. By now, the world of medieval law may feel less like a legal system and more like a language built from rituals, symbols, punishments, and prayers. Each law was a sentence in that language, each custom a kind of punctuation, and the people who lived within it were always reading, always interpreting what was allowed, what was sacred, and what might get them cast out. But while many laws governed behavior, some laws governed space. Cities and villages were shaped not only by their architecture, but by their rules. Rules that told you where you could go, how far you could walk, even which gate you could enter depending on your status. In many medieval towns, gates closed at sundown, not simply to keep out enemies, but to contain the moral fabric of the city. Strangers arriving after hours were often turned away, or required to sleep outside the walls, near the leper's hut or the edge of the cemetery. To be let in after dark was a privilege. This idea, that space itself carried legal meaning, echoed in other places too. Markets were not just locations, they were legal zones. Within their bounds, certain protections applied. Disputes could be settled peacefully. Sellers and buyers were subject to specific laws. If a fight broke out outside the market square, it might be judged more harshly, because it had interrupted the sacred rhythm of trade. Similarly, churches offered what was known as sanctuary. If you fled into a church accused of a crime, you could claim temporary protection. The idea was that God's house was neutral ground above earthly vengeance. Once inside, you had a set number of days, often 40, to confess, negotiate, or prepare for exile. Sometimes sanctuary led to real safety. Other times it merely delayed punishment. But in both cases, it was a powerful symbol. That law, even in its harshest forms, recognized the possibility of mercy. And mercy, too, was codified. A lord could issue pardon for a crime committed by his subject, often in return for service or payment. Monarchs might declare general amnesties during coronations or holy festivals. These were not only acts of forgiveness, they were performances of power. To forgive, one had to first be in a position to punish, and so mercy became a kind of theatre, an act that reminded everyone who held the scales. But it wasn't always nobles or kings who shaped justice. In small villages, communal law reigned. Elders gathered in taverns or under trees to settle disputes. The rules were unwritten but understood. If you borrowed a tool and didn't return it, you might be shamed at the well. If your goat wandered too often, neighbors might agree to tether it themselves, and you'd owe them drink or bread in thanks. This wasn't law in the formal sense. It was law as memory, law as tradition, law as habit, passed from hand to hand. In these moments you see something almost modern, restorative justice, a focus on repair, on healing relationships rather than punishing individuals. Of course, not all communities practiced this. Some laws were cruel, some punishments irreversible, branding, mutilation, execution. But even within that, there was ritual. Executioners, for instance, followed codes of conduct. They dressed in specific garments. They performed their duties with a practiced solemnity, not out of reverence for death, but for the order it was meant to restore. Public executions were legal events, but also social ones. People gathered, vendors sold food, children watched, and in between horror and spectacle, people absorbed the message, this is what happens when you break the rules. But over time, these spectacles began to change. Whispers of reform stirred. Some thinkers, scholars, clerics, even nobles, began to question the nature of justice. Was pain always necessary? Could punishment teach? Could mercy be more than performance? These were early questions, small, quiet, but they mattered, because they planted the seeds for legal evolution, and that evolution would come, slowly, through charters, through revolts, through treaties and declarations, the Magna Carta, the rise of parliaments, the beginnings of written common law. But those would arrive later. For now, in the candlelit courts and echoing cathedrals of medieval Europe, justice remained a ritual of paradox, part law, part faith, part performance. And always, it asked the same question. Who decides? Who decides what is right? Who decides what is fair? And who decides whether a broken thing should be punished or mended? It's a question we still ask today, and perhaps that's what makes these strange laws so quietly powerful. Not their outcomes, but their echoes. They remind us that justice has never been simple, that fairness has always been pursued, but rarely caught, that every rule begins with a hope, and every judgment with a choice. So as you sink deeper into stillness, let these laws settle like dust in a long-forgotten courtroom. Let the questions drift with you into sleep. They were asked before you, they'll be asked again, and in their asking the world keeps trying, imperfectly, stubbornly, to become better. Woe Central 3 Part 26. As the candle burns lower and the night deepens, we begin to sense that our journey through these strange laws is not only about the past, it's also about us, because beneath the medieval rituals, the odd punishments, the curious traditions, we begin to recognize familiar questions. We see ourselves not in their customs, but in their intent, in their search for justice, for order, for meaning in chaos. We might never try a pig in court or weigh a crime with a red-hot iron, but we do still ask, how do we decide right from wrong? Who gets to speak? Whose story is believed? The Middle Ages were filled with fear, fear of hunger, disease, war, the unknown. And law, in its most raw form, was a response to that fear. It was a way to hold on to something solid, something that said, here is the line, step across it, and there will be consequence. But law wasn't just reactive, it was imaginative. To walk through medieval Europe is to enter a world where justice was dramatic, ceremonial, and deeply symbolic. You could be punished for wearing the wrong color. You could be protected by a church wall. You could be judged by your neighbors, your priest, your reputation, or your willingness to carry a glowing iron rod in your bare hands. And in that swirl of drama and devotion, the law wasn't just a tool, it was a mirror. It showed people who they were supposed to be. A faithful subject, a loyal wife, a pious merchant, a quiet laborer, a noble knight. It gave them roles, boundaries, a sense of the divine pattern. And in giving that, it also took something away. Because when laws are used to define order, they also exclude. They silence those who don't fit the roles. They punish those who question the pattern. They protect those who already hold power. And so, while the law kept towns running and neighbors civil, it also kept many voices quiet. The law decided who could speak in court, who could own land, who could love and how, who was believed, who was dismissed, and in those choices we begin to see the deeper shadow beneath the strange laws. That law is never neutral. It is always shaped by fear, belief, convenience, and desire. And yet, even with all its flaws, it is also shaped by hope. The hope that rules can keep peace, that order can protect the vulnerable, that we can build something better. Medieval Europe didn't have equality. It didn't have civil rights. It didn't have representation as we know it. But even then, people dreamed of fairness. They spoke of just rulers, of wise judgment, of laws that lifted instead of crushed. And slowly, so slowly, those dreams shaped change. In the 13th century, the Magna Carta began to limit royal power, forcing even kings to answer to law. Guilds formed to protect workers' rights. Peasants revolted, demanding relief from taxes and corruption. Voices rose in corners of the world that had long been silent. And though the laws were still strange, still unequal, still harsh, they began to bend, and that bending continues, even now, because we are still writing the law. Every debate, every protest, every courtroom trial, every election, we are still asking, what is justice? Who deserves protection? What does fairness really look like? And the strange laws of the Middle Ages remind us how far we've come, and how much further we have to go. They remind us that law is not just something handed down, it's something built. It changes, it reflects us, and sometimes it transforms us. So as this night deepens and you rest your eyes, think of the people who once walked under torchlight through narrow streets, carrying bread, carrying burdens, carrying stories. They were not so different. They worried about their children. They wanted safety. They laughed at absurdity. They whispered secrets. They broke rules. They asked questions, and in doing so, they kept the world turning. Just as you do now. Let that be your comfort tonight. That law, strange as it is, has always been written by people, and people can choose again. They can choose better. They can write something kinder. So sleep, gentle soul. The laws of the past are behind us, but the laws of tomorrow, those are still being written. And you, in ways big and small, are part of that story too. 0713-207. We've walked far, haven't we? Through cold stone courts, along muddy village paths, under the heavy shadows of cathedrals and castle gates. We've listened to laws that seem strange, even laughable, and others that echo still, soft and sharp as memory. And now, as the torches burn low and the town quiets, we find ourselves at the edge of the story. But before we rest, let us pause here, in the in-between, between then and now, between judgment and mercy, between forgetting and remembering. Because even at the end, the strange laws of medieval Europe still have something to say. They remind us that law was never just a list of rules. It was a ritual, a belief, a kind of story we told each other over and over again to explain how we should live, and what happens when we don't. And that story was written in the language people understood best: punishment and forgiveness, honor and shame, blood and bread and bells. Law was a daily presence, not tucked away in books, but carved into routine. It rang in church towers, it spoke through market stalls, it glinted in the blade of a sword and lingered in the hush before curfew. And always it watched, not because people were wicked, but because they were human, prone to error, full of desire, capable of kindness and cruelty in the same breath. So the law tried to help. It tried to contain the wildness of the world. And when it couldn't, it performed. With trials in public squares, with oaths and relics and processions, with pigs in courtrooms and criminals in hair shirts, with stories that made fear manageable and order feel divine. And beneath all of that was a quiet, persistent longing that maybe, just maybe, justice was possible, that balance could be restored, that wrongs could be righted, not just with punishment, but with meaning. You see, law in the Middle Ages wasn't merely reactive, it was creative. It imagined what peace might look like, then tried, sometimes beautifully, sometimes brutally, to build it. And though we often shake our heads at the absurdity of some medieval rulings, we forget what they were trying to do. They were trying to make sense of being alive, of loving someone who didn't love you back, of losing crops to weather and family to illness, of feeling powerless in a world that moved fast and punished slowly. And the law gave people something to hold on to. A shape, a pattern, a path through the woods. Not a perfect one, no. But when the world is uncertain, even a crooked path feels like hope. And maybe that's what draws us to these old stories. Not the strangeness, but the effort. The effort to govern not just behavior, but belonging. To say, you are part of this world, and here are the rules that will keep you safe, or at least seen. Even if they fail, even if they falter, even if they forget to be kind, we still reach for rules because they help us remember each other, and because they remind us that civilization is fragile, but not impossible. That order can be rebuilt. That meaning can be made even after loss. That fairness, though rarely finished, is always worth chasing. So as you rest now, and the final embers of this story begin to dim, take comfort in this. You are not alone in your questions, not the ones about fairness, or justice, or how to hold grief without letting it turn to stone. Others have asked them too, long ago, in cloaks and sandals and boots worn to holes. They asked with law, with laughter, with prayer. And though the world they lived in is gone, the questions remain. And so do the hands that reach forward to answer them. One line at a time, one law at a time, one story at a time. And so we walk on, deeper into the dim-lit avenues of a world ruled by rules, some strange, some sacred, all deeply human. By now the question isn't whether these laws were fair or foolish. The question becomes, what were they trying to preserve? Because in every medieval town, behind every parchment, every bell tower, every courtroom procession, there was a quiet urgency, not just to govern behavior, but to shape a shared reality, to remind people of who they were and what bound them together. And for many the answer was simple: Law made belonging possible. When life was uncertain, when illness struck without warning, when crops failed, when wars came close, people turned to the law not only for protection but for direction. They asked it, how do we move forward? What do we owe each other now? And the law responded with ritual, with ceremony, with memory passed from one hand to another, from council table to child's ear. Some of those memories were painful, others were almost tender. A village elder reciting the boundaries of a parish in rhyme, passed down for generations. A midsummer market where disputes were settled not with blood, but with bread and witness. A tradition in one region where every spring, the oldest woman in the village tapped a staff 3 times on the church floor to declare the law renewed for the year ahead. In these acts, law became more than punishment. It became rhythm, continuity, a way of saying, this is who we are and we're still here. And that matters, because so much of the medieval world was designed to remind people of their smallness. The scale of cathedrals, the reach of kings, the silence of plague years. But law, in its daily rituals, gave people something they could touch, something they could speak back to. You might not be able to change the seasons. You might not be able to stop the war. But you knew when bread was weighed. You knew who rang the bell. You knew how many lashes a lie might cost you. And you knew your neighbor would receive the same. There was comfort in that symmetry, even when it hurt. And yet laws were not always even. A noble could sometimes escape what a shepherd could not. A merchant might bribe his way to clemency, while a widow paid in coin and tears. This imbalance wasn't hidden. People knew, and over time it fed a quiet fire beneath the system. A longing not to destroy law, but to make it kinder. To make it feel less like stone and more like soil. In some places that longing took root. Courts began to keep better records, not to punish more, but to protect those accused falsely. Towns appointed ombudsmen, early defenders of the people's concerns. Charters were drafted, not by kings alone, but by assemblies. In these moments you feel the law stretch, breathe, adapt, still imperfect, still flawed, but trying. And isn't that what we all do? We try. We try to write rules for things that don't always fit in ink. We try to build systems to catch what slips through the cracks. We try to define fairness, even when it shifts beneath our feet. The medieval world tried too, and their laws, for all their oddity, were part of that effort. They tried to make theft less dangerous. They tried to make speech more careful. They tried to make death less senseless. They tried to make communities stronger. Not always well, not always wisely, but with the tools they had and the dreams they could imagine. And perhaps that's what echoes most softly through these stories, not the strangeness of the laws, but the humanity of those who lived under them. The baker who feared the weight of the scale, the child who memorized the curfew bell, the widow who knew exactly how long sanctuary would last. They lived within the lines, but also between them. They joked, they protested. They whispered dreams of other ways, better ways, and over centuries some of those whispers became words. Some of those words became laws. Some of those laws are still with us, and some are still waiting to be written. There is 703.109. There's something quietly beautiful about the way laws linger. Even when the world that wrote them is long gone, even when the language has faded and the punishments forgotten, somehow the shape of the law remains, not in the details, but in the echoes, in the stories, in the instincts passed down from voice to voice, from memory to motion. And in this final stretch of our journey, not yet the end, but close, we return to the quiet idea at the heart of it all. That law is not just a list of limits. It is a mirror, held up gently or sternly to remind us of who we think we are and who we hope to become. In the Middle Ages, this mirror often reflected fear. Fear of sin, fear of scarcity, fear of losing place, honor, or soul. But it also reflected faith. Faith that balance was possible, that mercy might intervene, that the world, however chaotic, could be arranged, if not always justly, then at least with intention. And so the people of that time wrote rules for what they feared most, for betrayal, for blasphemy, for hunger, for lust, for laughter in the wrong place. Some laws were harsh, yes, some were strange, but many were just ordinary. A rule about where to place your shoes at a bathhouse, a fine for dumping ashes too close to a neighbor's well, a code regulating the size of loaves sold on Sundays. These weren't grand gestures of control. They were the fabric of daily life, threads of habit and order and shared understanding. Because when you can't control the wind or the harvest or the whims of a distant lord, you cling to what you can shape. And so people shaped rules. They made them precise. They made them visible. And when the rules failed, they adapted. Not always easily, not always kindly, but with persistence. We see this in the slow shift from ordeal to evidence, from superstition to inquiry, from divine judgment to human reasoning. The law began to ask different questions, not just, what did God decree, but also, what does this person deserve? Not just, how do we restore honor, but also, how do we repair harm? And that's when law began to soften, just slightly. Like snow falling on stone, juries replaced trials by combat. Written contracts replaced oaths sworn over relics. Appeals were allowed. Precedent took root. It wasn't progress in the way we might define it now, but it was movement. And in a world bound by tradition, movement mattered. Because movement meant memory. It meant people remembered what felt unjust, what stung, what left scars, and they carried that remembering into new rules. That's why, even today, echoes of medieval law remain, not in form, but in feeling. When we seek equal treatment, we remember a time when justice bent toward wealth. When we demand transparency, we recall a world of closed doors and sealed scrolls. When we insist on dignity, we echo the silent prayers of those who once stood a trial alone, afraid. So yes, the old laws may be gone, but their lessons remain. They remind us that justice is not automatic. It must be tended, spoken aloud, checked and challenged, refreshed by each generation, not just in courtrooms, but in kitchens, in classrooms, in conversations between friends. And they remind us that the law, for all its power, is fragile, that without compassion it becomes cold, that without memory it repeats its mistakes, that without love it forgets its purpose. Because that's what we often overlook, that the deepest laws are not carved in stone or ink. They are carried in care, in the way we watch over one another, in the way we say, I'll listen, I'll wait, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. Those are laws too, soft ones, but binding. They keep families together, they mend neighborhoods, they give strangers a second chance, and they last far longer than statutes. So as we near the end of this long and winding path, hold this thought gently. You are not ruled only by systems, you are ruled too by stories, by customs, by kindness. And just as the people of medieval Europe shaped their world with strange, beautiful, imperfect laws, you are shaping yours now, with your choices, with your values, with the way you move through the dark and decide, again and again, not just to endure, but to care. That is a kind of law too, and perhaps the most enduring of all. 0703-310. And now, at last, we arrive, not at a courtroom, not at a gallows, but at something softer, something slower, a quiet place near the edge of sleep, where laws no longer bind, but stories remain. You've listened patiently to the strange rules of another time, to laws about shoes and shadows, bread and bells, beasts and bones, and beneath each one, beneath the parchment and penalties, you've seen something more enduring. A portrait of people who tried, who failed, who reached toward justice in the only ways they knew how. And maybe that's what we need most to remember. That law, at its best, is not about perfection. It's about presence. It says someone is watching, someone is listening, someone is trying to keep the world from unraveling completely. In medieval Europe, this effort took many shapes. A mother warning her son to come home before the curfew bell, a baker weighing his loaves to avoid the shame of short measure, a child memorizing the chant of a court prayer, not to understand, but to belong. And it is in these small moments that law becomes human. It becomes rhythm, pattern, something passed down like a lullaby or a recipe, familiar, flawed, and full of care. Because law is not just about punishment. It is about the stories we tell to make sense of what hurts, to name what matters, to ask again and again, how do we live with each other? Not near each other, but with, through disagreements, through disappointments, through difference. The people of medieval Europe didn't always answer well, neither do we, but they asked, and they built rituals around their asking, rules to hold grief, to mark betrayal, to protect hope. Some of those rules seem ridiculous now, but others still hold. The right to speak in your own defense, the belief that no one is above the law, the idea that harm should be acknowledged and not hidden. These ideas were born not in theory, but in trial, in sweat, in hunger, in the aching aftermath of mistakes, and they grew slowly, like moss on stone, like ivy up a wall. So now, here you are, at the end of a long walk through a world of strange customs, heavier winters, and colder rooms. And maybe, like the people we've met along the way, you carry your own questions. What is fair? Who decides? What makes a life feel safe? And if so, good. Let the questions stay. Let them move gently through your thoughts, not as burdens, but as quiet companions. Because the point of this story was never to laugh at the past. It was to feel it, to notice how close it still is, how much we still yearn for order that doesn't punish, for rules that protect without breaking, for justice that remembers mercy, that listens, that waits, that leaves space for someone to change. These too are laws, unwritten, unenforced, but felt, and sometimes those are the ones that last. So now, dear listener, let the echoes fade, let the torches burn low, the parchment close, let the courtrooms grow still, and the streets empty once more. You've travelled far, you have listened well, you have walked beside 1,000 silent voices who once feared judgment, or begged pardon, or simply tried to live. Let their efforts rest in you, and let sleep carry you gently, not into silence, but into trust. The trust that even in a world of flawed rules and imperfect justice, we still return to each other, still try to understand, still care enough to ask the hardest questions, And sometimes we even answer them, not with laws, but with love. Good night.